We are live. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to WeatherBrains episode number 659. This is the weekly show all about weather. You know that. This is the show for September 4th, the day after Labor Day 2018. It's a Tuesday night special. And this is the time of the show where we share boring personal stories, humorous anecdotes, and occasionally say excessively outrageous things. And occasionally we have a hurricane making landfall during the show.
Yeah, just a little thing like that.
So
it's like underwent an eye wall replacement right as it made landfall, or as it's making landfall.
Yeah, I don't know if that's technically what that is, but it sure looks like it.
It's definitely developed a concentric eye wall. And the other one,
you have an eye wall replacement cycle in a tropical storm is the question. Which
the interesting thing is how much the cloud tops have warmed in the last hour. I mean,
where's John Hope? We need him.
We sure do. All right, James, I'm going to give you an address to invite because I think that's the only way anymore that you can do this.
Hey, tap on that mic and let's see. Be sure you got the right mic.
I may not have.
You do not.
I can fix that in 2 seconds. I can. It doesn't show up. Oh, that's not good. Well, it doesn't recognize the microphone.
Yeah, for those watching, we typically do this on Monday nights. We opted to not labor on Labor Day. Well, some of us labored. We just didn't do the show last night, so we'll do it on a Tuesday night. And then, last week we were live in St. Louis, so we'll be back to the regular Monday night shenanigans next week. So, yeah, Brian sent me a little note. I've been working the morning shift for a couple of mornings, and I'm a little tired, and I can't make it tonight. Oh, Brian, come on, man. You got to hang in there for us old people. He's worked 2 morning shifts, and he's dead. Now, I will say this. The morning shift is brutal if you've ever worked it on television. I have worked 1 morning shift in probably 30 years, one. And it was at this station maybe about 15, 16 years ago. For some reason, I had to speak in Starkville. And the only way to make it happen, I had to work a morning shift. And my head was spinning, man. It was just like, what just happened to me? I was hung up in a hurricane here. So I'll give him a break. It is a brutal shift. And every year it seems to get longer and longer. They started at like 4 a.m. or something now.
Exactly. It starts at 2:30.
Yeah, before you know it, they'll just come on at midnight. It'll be the all night news show.
All right, James, how does that sound? Is that better? Is that too hot?
Yeah, you got the right mic now. So
yeah.
Where are you?
I'm at home.
Looks like a different background there.
It does.
Okay, starting to look familiar. Different angle, I guess. Aubrey, how are you?
This phone is weird. Just
you're losing bandwidth. You're losing bandwidth.
Yeah, may tell my Xbox players to cease and desist. I'll be right back.
Yeah, you got bandwidth issues there.
Aubrey, don't forget to invite the guest there, James.
I did. And we're not hearing a word Aubrey is saying.
How about now?
Yes.
Perfect.
Loud and clear.
I had to reset things up throughout this new edit bay that I'm in.
Oh, a new one. What number is that?
I am in 4. Edit 4 tonight.
4. I'll be honest with you. This is horrible. I don't even know. I've not been back to our station's area where they used to edit or still edit, I guess, in probably 10 years. I don't even know if we have.
You took me by there, remember?
Okay, well, that's been recently. So do they? So that's the thing. Do you have edit booths anymore? Because the people I see, they're mostly editing on laptops in the field.
I think
they just don't.
We caught a photographer in there. I think you caught a photographer in there when we were doing the station tour, and you were walking me around.
Okay, well, I guess they do because I know they've got some people that edit just the stuff for the newscast, not the original photographers. And I could see them working back in these things, but it just seems like most of the photographers just edit out in the field wherever they are on a laptop now.
The one that we talked to said that, yeah, they do most of it out in the field.
Yeah, it's so different. I just don't get out much anymore, but they all the live shots are live views. These, the little boxes that send the video down the cell networks. Now I can't use those things because there's too much latency. That long delay, because if I use a live view, the weather graphics don't match what I'm saying on television. So they still have to bring out a microwave or a satellite truck for me.
Yeah, we've tested some things because I like to run the graphics through. If I can run the live shot through the weather computer, then I kind of simulate this 3D graphic thing, but it still has just like a half a second delay that we have to be very careful with it.
Yeah, I'm not that good. I've never tried that. I don't do that. I use TeamViewer in my phone to change the graphics, and they just take them full screen. We don't get too creative. And again, I don't get out that much, although I have noticed that the news director is sending me out to county fairs beginning this week, every Thursday. I don't know how, and those are fun. I don't mind. I mean, sometimes you get some good food, have some fun.
Our fairs are done with. They're over.
Really?
Yep. We're because it's such a high agriculture area, they usually try and do them kind of right before that school gets back in. Wow.
So I've got one every Thursday night through mid-October 18th. So
wow.
And again, and they're pretty good about it. If we have active weather, they just kill it. I mean, if there's anything going on, you can't do severe weather or really active, tropical or something out at a circus, or when you got some guy barfing on the tilt-a-whirl behind you. And that's a show title. That is a show title. Some guy barfing on the tilt-a-whirl. But we're trying to get all the good show titles come in the pre-show. We're trying to get them in the actual recorded show here. So, yes, I did invite our guest. We're in this phase of the show now where we can't get our guest on. And anytime we can't get them on for like an extended period of time, we know they have a huge IQ. The bigger the brain of our guests, the lower the chance of getting him on the hangout easily. Notice Kevin got on right away.
How did y'all do last week getting the guest on? Did it go well?
Well, we were all together. We were sitting side by side, man.
Well, but the week before that, when we had the fellow from Japan, how did that go?
I thought it went pretty well. I'm trying to think.
I don't understand why my guests are never able to see the invites anymore.
I don't know. Here comes somebody.
There he's coming.
Okay, there we go. Okay. And you wanted me to put my ear. You wanted me. You hear me?
Yes, you sound good.
And you wanted me to put my earbuds on, right?
That would be helpful.
Well, I guess I better put these on so I can hear you.
Yeah.
You wanted these. You wanted these on, right?
Perfect.
Okay. Oh yeah, you sound really good.
I hope I have bandwidth. I've turned off every streaming device in the neighborhood.
Okay.
Bill, we got to get you this gigabit fiber deal.
Right here. I got it in the mail today, and I am getting it. Whatever it is, no matter how much it costs.
What's gigabit fiber?
AT&T has fiber to a number of residential communities now, and if you are on their fiber, you can get up to gigabit in theory connectivity, and
which probably technically means you get like what, 1 megabit.
No, there have been nights where I have gotten 900 down.
Really?
When I come home.
It's on yours, James.
If we have data limits, I'm not aware of them, and we. Again, I'm pushing, in the morning, I'm pushing TV video, I'm uploading videos, but it's just stunning because, it used to be like you'd upload a video and it takes 5 minutes. With this thing, you press the button and you think, what happened?
What's your upload speed?
The highest upload speed I've seen on a speed test is 925.
Upload? Wow.
Yeah, it's synchronous. It's not asynchronous, so it's the same.
But at what point does if you're downloading something, you're pinging somebody else's server, and so at some point you're dependent on that, right?
Right. I have never gotten a full gig anywhere. In theory, I guess if I set up a server at the house next door, I should be getting something like that. But yeah, there's so many variables involved in those speed tests. And there's some nights I'll come home and it's like 500. It's like half. But still, 500, that's just... I remember when I got DSL back in the late 90s. I was the first kid on the block with ADSL. And I got like 1 meg down, and nobody could believe how fast. Nobody could believe how fast that was. The whole neighborhood, they were over there just watching how incredibly fast that is. So that was in the late 90s. Here we are almost 20 years later, and now we've gone from 1 meg to 1 gig.
Yep. I remember doing that fax product. I had a subscription to WeatherBank, and I watched that thing come in line by line on the modem, and then sending the faxes out. Oh my goodness!
Yeah. Hey, let's get this thing started. I think we're all here. Who's going to be here? Kim is. She's so close. Well, she hasn't delivered that baby, has she? To our knowledge,
I've not heard.
Okay. Let's get this thing going.
Give it a little pressure drop and.
She's importing her way.
She's traveling to Biloxi right now.
Yeah,
well, the one that comes next week will probably be the one that bursts the baby.
Yep. Here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hey, it's the weekly show that's all about weather. This is WeatherBrains, episode number 659. Every week we gather together, we talk weather. Thank you for taking the time to watch and or listen. We know that most of you listen. We also know some of you watch. And for those that do that, we thank you and had a great time last week. We were gathered together, Kevin, and you were not with us in St. Louis. We were so sorry.
You have a good time?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was fun. I thought it was great. You know, Bill got a lot of hand with the 50-cent beer night at the Hooters across the street. But other than that, it was all good.
Well, and we have to ask Aubrey on all of these events now, did you use the bail money?
We might have used it for her. What are you talking about?
Yeah, I don't know if I should say. Let's just say I had a very good time.
Well, there you go.
What stays in St. Louis, or what goes on in St. Louis stays in St. Louis, right?
Yes, that's right. And Bill, do you have any breaking news for us tonight?
Am I supposed to?
On a location for next year? Do we?
We interrupt this program for a CBS Radio Net Alert Bulletin.
I'll be the last to know.
I rolled the intro for nothing.
I thought it was Phoenix.
We need to know. We need to know if someone.
We're all waiting. I know. I had to turn in my budget today with a big question mark.
I thought it was Phoenix.
I thought Anchorage. Yeah, it's in Anchorage.
I thought Phoenix was decided already.
We know it's somewhere in the southeast.
No, the clearly it's going to be in the southeast United States. We don't know. And for those that are wondering, we are talking about the National Weather Association annual meeting. We all were live, most of us, in St. Louis last week at this year's gathering, and nobody knows where next year's NWA annual meeting will be. They didn't announce it.
I usually like to give the location a warning before I arrive.
Yeah,
and set up the bail money.
Kind of like the Tasmanian devil.
Stock the cooler.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
But no, St. Louis was good. Bill did a great job with the Weatherfest. I mean, goodness, that museum ought to be giving you free tickets for life, man. You drew in the biggest crowd they've had in years, probably. Wow.
Yeah, 5,895 people came, which was really wonderful.
Wow.
The tweets were awesome. I don't know who was running Twitter, but the tweets were great, especially as a lot of us were kind of traveling in that day.
Well, there were a bunch of folks, but Camden Walker and Trevor Boucher were sort of leading.
Trevor, I should have known. Trevor's always
social media.
got social media down. Yep.
But I mean, James, you had to be amazed at the yellow shirts. The 70 volunteers were an impressive crew.
No, and these people have stuff to do, and they've got stuff to do all day. And to pull hats off to Bill and everybody.
And they didn't come and sit in the corner. I mean, they worked the entire day, just as you did. I mean, you had 3 stage shows, and 100 things you were doing too. Spoke. So thank you for being there, James.
No, it was all good. We had a great time. Good to see Ginger Z. We had some kid shows, and we had a ton of fun. So looking forward to next year if we ever find out where they're going to have it.
I heard, by the way,
week before.
I saw there was a fair amount of grumbling that the company formerly known as WSI was not there either in training or nothing as far as hawking equipment, and there was a fair amount of grumbling about that. Was that in person too?
Mm-hmm.
The comments were made, yes, and I think a lot of comments were made to WSI even before, letting them know that this was really not a good idea.
I sense a growing amount of frustration for people using Macs, that there's a lot of bugs in that thing and a lot of radar product issues. And there's it's probably wild 384-hour GFS type speculation, but some are starting to speculate. It's like, why does IBM really care about that business unless it's providing some level of data? Because that's what they're interested in. And people are starting to say, well, are they going to get tired of this and cast it aside?
Well, on Barron's product, Barron showed up. Actually, I ran into 2 of their presenters in the airport in Atlanta on my layover. I heard someone say meteorologist, and I kind of poked my head in the conversation. Are you guys going to St. Louis? But I talked to them, and their product looked really, really good. So what they were presenting, I think was really awesome. They were doing some great demonstrations, and their big thing now, I think they had put out some new traffic stuff, new traffic graphics.
Right. So, Bill, what was their excuse for not showing up to the NWA?
I don't know that, that question, or the answer to that question, Kevin. We, of course, tried to get them at Weatherfest, but couldn't get any interest at all. And I'm sure Janice spent a great deal of time and effort, encouraging them to come to the, to exhibit at the annual meeting. But
and for those that don't know, WSI is a major producer of weather graphics, hardware and software that television stations use. And really, it's kind of boiled down to 2 companies, IBM and Barron, that do these weather graphic systems. And the WSI, the IBM folks, were a no-show, not only at the NWA, but also at the AMS. And it makes you wonder, are they giving up on this business? Are they just phasing it out?
You start to see these little signs. Another one, I've been up to OU a couple of times in the last few weeks, and Barron donated a system, one of their systems, to OU Nightly, their nightly newscast on the journalism side, for the meteorology students to do weather. And they went and asked the weather company, and they were rebuffed. So there's another little sign. Yeah, they said, no way, we're not going to bother to do that.
And I was really disappointed, because those training sessions, when I was in Norfolk and I did a couple of WSI training sessions, I mean, I had half a notebook full of notes, and I'm going, I didn't know you could do this. This is awesome. So those, and I told WSI that how helpful it was by having them there for that training, and that was, a necessity, I thought.
Yeah.
But scoff.
They appear to not love us anymore. Speaking of OU, though, I was up there last week because Rick, I wish Rick was here, and I wish Kim was here too. She might be getting close to having that baby. But I got to sit with her at an event that Rick sent out a note about. What's his title? Dr. Neil Jacobs is the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Environmental Observation and Prediction and Deputy NOAA Administrator. But he's touring the country doing listening sessions, and he came to the National Weather Center, and I was up there for that on Thursday. There were some fairly interesting things. He didn't talk a great deal, because a listening session, you're supposed to let people go around the room and say things. But what I heard, and again, I wish Kim was here to back me up, the first thing I heard was, and I'm oversimplifying, is greater private industry, private company weather enterprise partnerships are coming. And the basic premise, as I understood it, was that NOAA can't pay for all the things that it wants to do or anybody wants to do, but private industry, if there is some level of payoff or return on investment, that they can go off and do some of those things. And so they recognize that, and that's one of the reasons why they think that they are going to be moving further in that direction, which is kind of cool when you think about a company like, WDT, which does radar scope, and companies that do really cool things. It begins to get a little bit scary when you start to think about AccuWeather. And I love all the people at AccuWeather. I think they do a great job. It's just AccuWeather management. They have a history of being somewhat troublesome, but you can't pick and choose, apparently. So that's where they're going with that. The other thing that was really interesting is they have people just feverishly modifying code for their weather models. And one of the things that they realized was to get into a government computer to run models or do tests or do work, it's a fairly cumbersome process. And even when you get in, you got to sit and wait in line for your turn on the machines. And that's become very difficult. So they are moving at a fever pitch to move a lot of their stuff into the cloud where other people can get access to it and run it on virtual machines, which is really very, very interesting, and probably coming faster than we think. Probably sometime next year, people would be able to get access to their computer models on cloud machines, which I thought was also very interesting as well. The other really interesting thing is every time I go up there, and I've been up there a couple times in the last few weeks, is I get a little peek behind the curtain at what our friend Kim Cloco McLean is doing up there. And she turns into a bigger deal every time I get there. She's running some pretty important stuff, and they know it. And she objects when you tell her, when you say that, when she's around. She's, no, I'm just in my little corner of the world. And I see Aubrey nodding her head, but I made a little joke to her the next day. I sent her a note, thanks, because I got to sit with her. But NOAA has said, you know what, we're not doing a good job at communicating uncertainty, and we're not doing a good job at communicating probabilities. And we also need to customize messages for an infinite number of different communities with regard to taking action and severe weather stuff. All of those things, we're not doing a great job. Kim, by the way, go and figure all those things out. And that's what they've told her. And she's doing it. We've all heard about the things that she's worked on, but Kim's a big deal. So we're obviously honored to have her, but it was good. It was good to be up there.
No, her home smells of rich mahogany. She has many leather-bound books.
That's true. That's true. And in a nod to this show, it was funny because there were a couple of things. One of the things that I was reading a little bit about, what he was talking about, Dr. Jacobs, was their strategic plan that they're putting into place, and part of the tone of that, I thought, what seemed to be more private weather industry partnerships, which I already mentioned, but I didn't see a lot of direct communication with the public. And that does seem to be a thing, that it's not, really moving a lot further in that direction other than what it is. And that bothered me a little bit. And I think Kim was a little concerned about that as well. And for those who don't know, Kim's about to give birth any day now. But at one point I sort of leaned over to Kim. She's always thinking about this show. I leaned over to her and I said, I can't remember what Dr. Jacobs had said, but I leaned over and I said, wow, this is just making me crazy. I said, I'm about to go into labor for you. And she giggled. Well, and then about 10 seconds later, well, that's the thing. About 10 seconds later, she leaned back over to me and whispered into my ear and she says, I'm about to go into labor for you should be Monday's show title.
Yes, that is the show title for this week.
There you go.
So we got to bring our guest in, but let me just say that Brian Peters has been working the morning shift. I'll give the guy a pass. He's been working some brutal hours, so he's off tonight. We're kind of in an odd situation. We're doing this on a Tuesday night. But before you bring in the guest here, Bill, I am really cranky. I got to go on a tirade. So we have a landfalling tropical storm just south of me on the central Gulf Coast tonight. And as is the case every day, people send me unbelievable videos and images, just stunning, very helpful, helps us communicate and tell the story. It is a win-win-win for everybody. People like that I share it. Some of it gets on television, some of it gets reshared. So now every time somebody sends me a picture or a video from the Gulf Coast, about 10 jabronis come on. Hello, I'm working the media desk at the BBC or the Weather Company or we would like permission to use your video on all of our platforms. Please fill out this form, blah, 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 blah. And then you get these guys that say you should never be giving that content away for free, contact me with a direct message. I'll show you how to monetize that. Never give it away free. So it's like these poor people that are sending me these wonderful images and video, they're creeped out. I wouldn't send anybody anything after they're brutally attacked. And it's like sometimes you'll see 12, 13, 14 people coming after him here. So it's like, come on, man. I mean, I got a big story. This is it's not a deadly Category 5 hurricane, but this is a high impact weather event here. Let us go for a little bit, please. And I got some other rants. We'll do it later. Bill, bring in our guest.
Yeah, James, honored tonight to have the author of 2 award-winning books. He's professor of history and sustainability studies at the University of Florida, a popular speaker on environmental topics, and he grew up on the subject that we're going to be talking about tonight. Jack Davis, welcome to the show tonight.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Jack, your book, the Gulf, The Making of American Sea, I picked it up when I was in St. Louis in July and advance work for this event that we had this past week up there. And, it's a nice, solid book. It's about 450 pages, Jack. And once I started reading it, I really couldn't put it down because, you lived in Birmingham at one point.
Yep.
And most people in Alabama, James included, probably, maybe Kevin, for the time you were here, we all, went to or go to the Gulf regularly. And it's an important part of our lives here. It's obviously an important part of our weather. So I really didn't know what to expect as I was walking into the book, and the deeper in that I waded, the more interested that I got. First talk for a minute about how the Gulf formed and why it's there and, how it came to be, Jack.
Well, the Gulf formed not from a meteor strike, as many people believe, and I get that question in a lot of my talks, a lot of my book events. It originated with the breakup of the supercontinent, Pangea, through rifting. What we know as the Yucatan Peninsula swung away from what we know as Florida, and then eventually this basin filled in with water. The Gulf of Mexico is actually older than the Atlantic Ocean, which is something I like about the Gulf of Mexico because geographers have described the Gulf of Mexico as a mere appendage of the Atlantic Ocean, and I take offense to that. And so I like the fact that the Gulf of Mexico is older is actually the older sibling to the Atlantic Ocean.
That's pretty cool. Talk for a minute. Give us a little survey of all the European explorers that kind of came around and tried to claim the Gulf for their respective nations.
Well, it was primarily the Spanish initially, then the French and the British. The Spanish spent over 300 years on the Gulf of Mexico, and for many, many years it was known as the Spanish Sea. And of course, before the Spanish came in the 16th century, the Gulf was occupied by perhaps as many as 400,000 or 500,000 Aboriginal people living all along the coast, from Cuba to Mexico or Texas around to Florida. And the Spanish didn't fare very well on the Gulf outside of Mexico, and the only reason why they fared well in Mexico is because they found silver and gold there, and they helped to find it in what is now the 5 U.S. Gulf states, and they didn't find any gold there. They found mainly death, often their own death, and they were also hoping to enslave people. I mean, that was their mission in coming to the Gulf and other parts of the New World, was to find gold and silver and slaves. And but you have to give the Gulf natives credit. They knew about the Spanish before the Spanish knew about them. These were seafaring people, had contacts all over the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. They knew that there were some shenanigans going on by these strangely clothed, bearded men down in the Caribbean. And by the time they arrived in the Gulf, the native peoples were ready for them and fought them off. They might put up a good fight against the University of Alabama football team.
I don't know. I don't know about this year.
Hey, Jack, since you're on history.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Bill. Since you're on history, you said at the top here it wasn't formed by a meteor. How did that theory come to be?
Well, a meteor did strike the Gulf off the the Yucatan Peninsula, and for a period there, there were there was speculation both by the scientific community and amateurs that this perhaps it was a meteor that formed the Gulf. And when you look at the Gulf, I describe it as being the shape of a brain, a human brain, or at least the side view of a brain. And you look at the Gulf and you think, oh, maybe so. Maybe a meteor did strike the Earth there. It would have been a quite large one, obviously. I mean, the Gulf is depending on who's doing the measuring, is either the 9th or 10th largest saltwater body of water on the Earth, and it's the largest Gulf in the world. But again, it would have been one hell of a meteor that would have formed the Gulf if that had been the case.
So these explorers like Narvaez had run-ins with hurricanes, didn't they, Jack? That sort of.
Oh my gosh! The Spanish had this knack for sailing during hurricane season, and of course, in those days there were no weather forecasters. And they weren't familiar with hurricanes until they got to the New World. It wasn't something that they encountered in the Mediterranean or that kind of weather in the Mediterranean or Europe. I mean, once they got down, started exploring Africa, and then the New World, they suddenly came across these tempests, as they referred to them, and so they didn't know anything about hurricane season as we do today. And it took us, a while to figure that out ourselves. But in any case, they lost a lot of ships. They lost a lot of men and women and cargo and livestock, and they lost a lot of gold and silver as well. I mean, there are 10 ships at the bottom of Pensacola Bay from a Spanish settlement that was colonization effort that happened in 1539. And if it had been successful, Pensacola, rather than St. Augustine, would be the oldest existing European city within the United States. But this hurricane wiped out the colony. It was as I write in the book, it was a textbook disaster. And the Spanish viceroy in Mexico said, okay, no more going to the Florida Panhandle. That's a dangerous place. And so the Florida Panhandle was off limits to Spanish, even though the Spanish claimed that part of North America. It was off limits to Spanish settlement for some 139 years.
Yeah, it's now off limits to spring breakers, at least in Panama City.
Well, they're pretty smart there.
Yeah, I would think so. So the Spaniards ran into this pitch-like substance in the Gulf. I thought that was an interesting story. And that obviously must have been oil, right, Jack?
That would have been oil. And they, of course, as I write in the book, they were looking at the future. This was on the Texas coast. And they were looking at the future. But, of course, they didn't recognize the future at that point. But both native peoples and the Spaniards what they did recognize was it was crude. They had come to the surface and in a gooey substance, and they recognized this as a type of pitch that they could use to seal their boats. And again, both the natives and the Spanish and the French did that.
And of course, we had a serious disaster several years ago with the Deepwater Horizon. And many of us thought that the Gulf might never be the same, but it seems like that it rebounded nicely. Put that in an environmental context and talk to us about how serious that event was.
Well, let me put it this way. The BP oil spill is not the worst environmental disaster that the Gulf of Mexico has suffered, not by far. Every day on the Gulf of Mexico is an environmental disaster that exceeds that oil spill. And the real impact if we're going to talk about the Gulf and if we're going to talk about the oil and gas industry alone, the real impact, the most significant impact comes from the onshore infrastructure that supports those offshore oil and gas platforms. An oil spill is horrible. The BP oil spill could not have been worse. But they attract a lot of media attention when they happen. What doesn't attract attention what is going on every day inshore around those the oil refineries, the oil pipelines that run from those offshore platforms to the inshore facilities. There, as I write in the book, there are 10,000 miles of canals, of oil industry canals that are carved in on the through the Louisiana coast in this marvelous estuarine environment that are causing tremendous damage, contributing significantally to shoreline erosion there. Louisiana's losing land. It's the only country in the state that is excuse me, growing smaller geographically, and those oil industry canals are contributing significantly to this erosion. The Galveston Bay suffers 200 to 300 toxic spills a year from the petrochemical industry. And all around the coast, if you talk about we can talk about the Gulf of Mexico dead zone, which in the summertime reaches the size of the state of Delaware. In good years, in better years, it gets larger in some years. There's a mini dead zone off the coast of Florida at the end of the Fenn Holloway River. That's the result of a cellulose plant. Engineering projects all around the Gulf, many of them that were undertaken long before we realized the impact. We're talking causeways, bridges, inlets cut through barrier islands. We're talking the Intercoastal Waterway. All those things have had a major impact on the estuarine environment in the Gulf of Mexico. And the Gulf of Mexico is one of the richest estuarine environments in the world, with some 200 estuaries around the Gulf of Mexico. And I can go on and on and on. And it's not, and the impact isn't just local or from local sources. It comes from faraway places too, from at the top of the Mississippi River and virtually every other river that flows to the Gulf of Mexico. Brings both good substance in terms of sediment and nutrients, but it also, those rivers often bring bad things such as agricultural runoff and industrial pollution and poorly treated wastewater as well.
So if Navarez had listened to the Native Americans and had eaten seafood, they might have had a much better go, probably. But you talk about seafood extensively and conservation efforts that have been responsible for saving some of the species that we know and love. Like, you know, I've got a list of them, but, you know, I remember red snapper, you know, as a child being a really extremely popular fish, and then it was overfished almost to extinction. Talk about how it came back, you know, into good standing.
Well, there are a couple of reasons for it coming back in good standing. By the one of the principal reasons, well, there are two principal reasons. One is that, you know, we learned to practice conservation in commercial fishing and also sport fishing. The other is that by the 1970s, virtually every bay around the Gulf of Mexico was on the verge of death, mainly because of wastewater pollution. This is before the Clean Water Act, mainly because of wastewater pollution. In those bays, it lost 60, 70, in the case of Escambia Bay in Pensacola, 95% of their seagrass beds. But when we stopped polluting the water, and when industries stopped polluting, and many of them came forward voluntarily, said, hey, you know, we live in this community too, you're right, we'll stop. And wastewater treatment plants were fixed. And many good people stepped forward to help replant those seagrass beds, many of them volunteers, many of them low-paid staff of conservation organizations, and brought those bays back to life. And bringing those bays back to life, they brought back the estuarine environment back to life that is essential to the marine life across the Gulf of Mexico. Now some people will say that the oil industry will say that its oil platforms are these artificial reefs, and that the fish thrive around those oil platforms, and they do. And there are many other artificial reefs that, mainly through volunteer efforts, have been established around the Gulf of Mexico, which act as like coral reefs, and they're wonderful habitat for marine life. And those rigs are too on some level, but the problem with the oil rigs is that I wouldn't eat a fish caught off of an oil rig because, yeah, you really do have to worry about contamination, even though you find a lot of marine. And a lot of sport fishers go out there and they do catch the fish and they eat the fish. And, you know, as far as I know, they still have all their digits on their hands and feet. But I personally would not eat a fish that spent a considerable amount of time around an oil rig. That said, fish don't stay in one place, right? They swim all over the place. So if you catch a fish that is off of an oil rig, it may have spent most of its life somewhere else. Or if you catch a fish in a bay, it may have spent most of its life on an oil rig. So we have to be careful. But as far as we know, for the most part, the marine life in the Gulf of Mexico is healthy. And I don't want to be all doom and gloom. There's some wonderful success stories in bringing the Gulf back to life. We can be smart. We've proven that in the past, and we certainly can move into the future being wise about the way we live our lives with the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, it is a story of redemption in many ways because, like you say, Pensacola Bay, many other bays around the Gulf of Mexico did make a comeback because of concerted efforts of environmental interests and industry, and it is a story of redemption, and we can't go backwards in that regard in terms of our environmental laws.
Well, we can, and we are doing.
I guess that's not the exact right word. Yeah, that's what I fear.
We are doing that, unfortunately, but you know, we've done this in the past, and the American people have said, "No, this is not what we want," and we've turned things back around again. And so a lot of people are worried, and I give talks all over the place. And I'm very busy on the speaking circuit, and people are always asking that question: what is the future of the Gulf? What's going to happen? What's going on with regard with what's going on with the EPA and the Department of the Interior? And I try to give them hope, and I say, this is not the first time this sort of thing has happened. And it was just a few weeks ago that the people in Florida said enough with the toxic algae that's running out of Lake Okeechobee, down to the Gulf of Mexico, destroying these environments, destroying our beach tourism. And they joined hands on the beaches of Florida and sent a message to Tallahassee and to the Army Corps of Engineers, who is largely responsible for these flows of toxic algae out into these estuarine environments. Into Washington, and said enough is enough. And the American people are fantastic people. And I wrote this book for the American people. I didn't write it just for Gulfsiders. I wanted Americans to know that we are all connected to the Gulf of Mexico, both historically and ecologically. Give you an example of ecological connection. Have you ever seen a Louisiana beach? They are pretty damn ugly, right? Yeah. They cannot compare with Mississippi's or Florida's or even Alabama's and Texas. And have you ever seen a plowed field in Iowa? Well, that's a future beach in Louisiana. Just to give you an idea of, a connection. The beautiful white quartz beaches of Florida were once mountaintop in the Appalachian. As I write in the book, if you walk on a beach, you walk on a mountain.
See the book at the Appalachian.
And over the eons, that quartz washed down through glaciers and rains and wind, eventually washed down to the Gulf of Mexico, mainly the Apalachicola River. And the Tennessee River, by the way, used to run all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, but under natural conditions shifted away. And the rivers in Texas, the Brazos, the Rio Grande, the Colorado, they bring sediment from as far away as the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And of course, the Mississippi River drains more than 40% of the United States and part of Canada. Parts of Western Western New York, and Minnesota. And so everybody has this connection to the Gulf of Mexico. Again, both historically and geologically.
And you mentioned in the book that the Appalachians were once much taller than they are now. That's
yeah, they were high as the Himalayan mountains, and we in Florida are grateful to the Appalachian Mountains for creating this beach. But also, as I point out, beaches were not the first tourist attraction in the Gulf of Mexico. Here again is a connection to this estuarine environment. It was a fish. It was a tarpon, and if anybody's caught a tarpon, they know that this is a wonderful fighting fish. Does incredible acrobatics. Back in the 19th century, you would catch a tarpon in a two-man skiff, and the tarpon would tow you around for 30 or 45 minutes. But the first one wasn't hooked, at least the first one on record wasn't hooked until 1885 by a New York architect by the name of William Halsey Wood down in Fort Myers. And when he hooked this tarpon, he set the sport fishing world on fire. And people from the Northeast, from the Midwest, and from the British Isles converged on the Gulf of Mexico in the late 19th century to catch a tarpon, mainly South Florida and Texas. And of course, the folks in Texas said their tarpons were bigger and feistier, as everything is supposed to be bigger in Texas, right? And there's some dispute over that. But in any case, once these tarpon fishers, men and women, a woman that held the tarpon record for 7 years in the late 19th century, a woman from Kentucky, but when they came down to catch tarpon, they started noticing the beaches, and many people started coming not to fish, but just for the beaches as well.
So Aubrey, I have a question for you. Can you name the bird that was once public enemy #1 to Theodore Roosevelt and an entire industry?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot. I don't know, but the story sounds familiar.
I bet Jack knows what I'm talking about.
No, well, if I do, it's escaped me.
The pelican.
Oh, the pelican. Oh, right. Yeah, is right. Well, it was public enemy #1 to the commercial fishermen during World War I, as I write in the book. And everybody who spends time in the Gulf fishing, or even not even fishing, maybe walking out on a fishing pier, you know who's going to be there. There's always a brown pelican. They love to get chummy with you when you've cast a line in the water. And they'll be, we've all seen them on the back of outboard motors waiting for a handout. And so during World War I, when the price of fish skyrocketed because America needed to feed Europe and its own people, fish became a lucrative commodity. And the commercial fishermen were claiming that the pelicans were competing with them. They were robbing them from their profits. They called them pirates and thieves and bandits and everything else. And they wanted to eradicate the pelicans, and they sought permission from Herbert Hoover, who was, of course, the U.S. Food Administrator at the time, and the governors of the states, the Gulf states, to get permission to eradicate the pelicans. But studies were done showing that the pelicans were not eating commercial fish, and they were eating smaller fish, and the amount that they were eating was insignificant. So the pelican was ultimately saved until DDT came along.
Right.
And then the pelican,
we had to save it again.
Yeah. And then the pelican disappeared from, you identify the pelican in Louisiana, right? But it disappeared from the Louisiana coast and much of the Mississippi coast and often Alabama. And then finally scientists realized that it was the DDT that was having an impact. And once its sale and use in the U.S. was outlawed, not just pelicans, but also eagles. We almost lost the eagles to DDT. When I was a kid growing up on the Gulf of Mexico in the 60s and 70s, I never saw a bald eagle. But the comeback of both the pelican and the eagle has been extraordinary, because at the same time that we're banning DDT's use in the U.S., we're cleaning up those bays. We're getting those estuaries back to thriving life. And where there is marine life, there are always birds. And they're a good friend of fisher people, because when you see pelicans out there diving in the water, you know exactly what's out there, and you steer your boat in that direction, because you'll get some fish.
Now, you mentioned that all the various Indian tribes around the Gulf made a good stand against the Europeans for 200 years, but couldn't stand the diseases that the Europeans brought. So that was significant. But disease was always an important factor around the Gulf Coast, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. You mentioned that Louisianans always knew that when the sugarcane crop was good, it was going to be a bad yellow fever year.
Yeah, that's right, because yellow fever comes from a mosquito that thrives in rainwater, and so in a rainy year, the mosquitoes were busy breeding, and of course yellow fever. The thing is, those port cities were the ones that were most affected by yellow fever, because that's the thing about a port city. It has an exchange of not just goods with the rest of the world, but also has this exchange of diseases. And so a lot of sailors would come in with the yellow fever virus unwittingly, and interact with the local community. And before anybody knew it, there would be a yellow fever outbreak. And one of the ironies in New Orleans during the 1853 yellow fever outbreak, which was the most devastating, which took several thousand lives, was that people who died and were put in the ground by their loved ones, and then their loved ones would bring flowers out to their graves in vessels that they would hold the flowers in water. Well, those vessels and that water became breeding ground for mosquitoes that carry the yellow fever pathogen. And one of the great ironies in American history, at least the history of disease.
But some of those beautiful beaches along the Gulf Coast provided some bit of protection and were a source of refuge for people in the cities that were beset by yellow fever, malaria, other things like that, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. And the people who could afford to would get out of the cities during the summertime. They weren't very comfortable. They were hot, but also the likelihood of getting sick or even deathly ill was greater in the cities during summertime, when some of those diseases, such as malaria and yellow fever, thrive. And so they would go to the beaches, some of the barrier islands on the Louisiana coast, over to Ocean Springs, Mississippi, Bay St. Louis, and Dauphin Island, Mobile. Many of the inland people would go down to of Alabama, go down to Mobile. And there were the breezes, slightly better temperatures, particularly at nighttime. And as long as there were breezes, they would help blow away those biting mosquitoes and midges, of course, which were sometimes even worse than the mosquitoes. Midges meaning, of course, the vernacular is no-see-ums.
Yeah, but you feel them, though, that's for sure. So, and a lot of people would take refuge at a place off the Louisiana coast called Last Island. And one of my favorite books as a child was a book from the library that talked about the Last Island hurricane. So talk about that event, because you covered extensively in the book.
Yeah, the Last Island hurricane was, as you said, it was a very, very popular retreat for the people who could afford to leave the city and to go to places like Last Island, and again, where it was more comfortable to be, and it was a place of leisure and largely wealth and leisure, and where people knew people and would get together every summer and meet up with old friends from the summer before. But then, Last Island was also a target of many hurricanes over the years, and one particular hurricane, unnamed hurricane, came through and devastated the island, swamped it completely, and people were trapped. They couldn't get off the island. I've forgotten the number of lost lives, but it was significant. And that more or less put an end to, a last island as a resort place for Louisiana. But it did not stop people from going to other barrier islands around the Gulf Coast and during the summer, and even eventually living there. See, this is one of the interesting. Another irony is that, as I write in the book, hurricanes are, a very common part of the Gulf of Mexico history and experience generally. And by the 20th century, after these devastating hurricanes, in many of these places, there would be building booms that would follow a hurricane. When people like Nash Roberts, the great TV weather forecaster in New Orleans, who was one of my favorite characters in the book, nobody could call a hurricane more accurately, not even the National Weather Service, more accurately than Nash Roberts. And what a great name for a weather forecaster, Nash Roberts. Could you think of, if you were writing a novel and you had to name a weather forecaster in your novel, could you come up with a better name than Nash Roberts, who's also the first meteorologist to fly into the eye of a hurricane, which he did during World War II. But Nash Roberts couldn't figure out why, after these devastating hurricanes, the American population was increasingly moving to the coast instead of away from the coast. This happened after Hurricane Camille, which I experienced as a kid living on the Florida Panhandle. This happened. I mean, look at how real estate prices in New Orleans have skyrocketed since Hurricane Camille. Even after the great Galveston hurricane in 1900, instead of abandoning this barrier island and moving the city to the mainland, what the Galvestonians do, instead of doing that and saying, well, let's use the barrier island as a barrier, they say, no, we're not going to let nature run us off our island. We're going to rebuild. And what do? They raise the island 7 feet by dredging the bay and build a long seawall and say, come on, nature, see if you can do it again. And of course, nature has done it again, not to the same extent as the 1900 hurricane. But that was in the days of great engineering projects, and engineers were American heroes, and engineers were not going to allow a hurricane to change the way people live. They were going to figure out how to live within harm's way, within those hurricane areas.
Well, Nash Roberts is a legend on the Gulf Coast, and I think he's one of the hurricane prophets. There have been a few. James invoked the name of John Hope tonight, who was an amazing man. James, did you ever get to listen to Nash Roberts on WWL?
WWL, when I was 13 years old, the year was 1969. And you guys know where I'm going with this story. I had a little transistor radio, and I stayed up all night listening to Nash Roberts cover the landfall of Hurricane Camille in August of 69. And, I was out of school, so I could kind of do that, even though I didn't tell anybody I was staying up all night. But it broke my heart when the sun came up the next morning, because the skywave went away and you couldn't hear it anymore. It was heartbreaking. So, but listening to Nash Roberts on that big blowtorch, WWL 870 Clear Channel at night, is one of the reasons I'm doing this. He was the best. He was fantastic.
And he was the only guy who was saying, Camille, the National Weather Service, like, no, it's going to hit the Florida Panhandle. And I live in Fort Walton Beach, and we stayed up too, because it was supposed to hit. We lived on Santa Rosa Sound, and it was supposed to come into our front door. And Nash Roberts is saying, no, it's going to hit Mississippi, and he was right. And everybody else said, no, it's going to hit east of Mississippi. And unfortunately, it was one of those devastating hurricanes. Cost a lot of lives.
And you talk about in the book that he sort of made his name during Hurricane Audrey in 1957.
Yeah, and that's I opened my chapter on hurricanes talking about Hurricane Audrey, because that's one of those hurricanes that took some 500 lives. But how many people remember? Maybe you guys do. But how many people remember Hurricane Audrey? Not really, not the nobody except for the people who experienced Hurricane Audrey or who had a family and member who was affected by Hurricane Audrey. But this devastating hurricane, and again, everybody was saying Hurricane Audrey is going to hit a day later than what, or a half a day later than what Nash Roberts was saying. And so people were not evacuating the coast. They were told you can stay, spend the night, and just leave in the morning. And Nash Roberts is saying, no, it's going to hit in the night. And indeed, it did hit in the night. And that's why 500 lives were lost, because people just were completely unprepared. And that's when they started listening to Nash and saying, and of course, James, you may remember this, people would walk around and say, what is Nash saying, or what does Nash say? Because he was godlike when it came to weather forecasting to the people on the Gulf, that part of the Gulf Coast.
And that's what they do in Birmingham. They say, "What did James say?"
Oh yeah, right. No, Nash. There were certain people that were like that, and unfortunately, most of them have passed. You had Nash Roberts in New Orleans, a guy named Roy Leap.
Oh, I grew up with Roy in Tampa. Yeah.
Oh, you know, Roy, you got to admit, Roy's pretty good now. He was pretty good.
Damn good. Yes. Yeah. And we said the same thing about him in Tampa.
Like Grady Norton and the great, National Hurricane Center directors along the way that, could almost go up on top of the building and commune with the storm, to kind of understand it. And I think Nash was one of those people.
Yeah.
And you had Harold Taft in Dallas. Now, Harold didn't do a lot of tropical weather, but Harold was of the same generation and of the same mold. He came in before you could look at the high resolution HRRR, you look at the high resolution NAM. He just looked at a bunch of upper air and surface charts and did it. And so that generation has faded. And I hate that, because those guys were indeed the best. And there was just something very appealing about that. Back in those days, you didn't have, and you would be glued to that radio. And all of those guys had clear channel radio stations. They broadcast on in addition to television. So, I missed that era, but boy, it was a marvelous time. I caught the tail end of it as I was growing up, and those guys are part of my inspiration for doing this today.
And Jack, talk about the role weather played in making Fort Sumter the first shot of the Civil War instead of Pensacola.
Well, another hurricane. In writing this book, I'm an environmental historian, as you said, and in writing this book, I didn't, about a sea, writing a biography of a sea is what it really is. I didn't want human events to dictate the narrative of the book, to dictate the way I organized or structured it. And I ended up organizing it around natural characteristics of the Gulf of Mexico, because I wanted to show nature as a historical agent, as this animating force that shapes the course of human history. And there's no better example of that than hurricanes, right? And so in 1539, I mentioned this earlier, when the Spanish settled Pensacola, a hurricane prevented Pensacola from being the first European city in the United States. Well, there was sort of a repeat of this with the outbreak of the Civil War. After the Confederate states, or after the Southern states joined the Confederacy, they decided to kick empty the federal establishments within their individual states. And there were a number of federal establishments around Pensacola. One was Fort Pickens. And the Confederates were prepared to attack Fort Pickens to get the Federals out, because they weren't leaving. A hurricane came along and delayed that attack. In the meantime, Confederate forces in South Carolina had attacked Fort Sumter, and Fort Sumter surrendered before the Confederates were even able to attack Fort Pickens. Now, if that hurricane had not happened, more than likely the first shots of the Civil War would have been fired at Pensacola.
So has anyone ever gone back and looked at that storm to see if it was warm core? Because that would have been in late March or early April, probably, Jack.
That's a good question. I don't know, and I did not, when I was doing my research, and did not run across anybody who had done that. But I wish we had talked a few years ago, because that would have been an interesting question to address.
So Aubrey, there's a hurricane project we can take on for our weather history deal, and I've got some cool stuff to share with you coming up, Aubrey. We'll have to
awesome.
work on that. Aubrey's our official in-house hurricane, Jack.
Okay.
Instead of Audrey, we have Aubrey.
It's very true. Hot mess.
Right.
When we go to the beach when I was a kid, we'd go to Pensacola Beach. We'd go through the city of Pensacola, which always smelled to high heaven because of the paper mill. And my dad's exact line every time in the car, because the kids would start complaining, and his exact words were, "Smells like money." And I thought that's very true. But talk about the processes that were perfected that make that terrible stench that we associate with paper mills.
Well, what you might have also been smelling in Pensacola was a wastewater treatment plant downtown, and which they didn't remove until the 21st century, despite and once they did, downtown Pensacola just boomed, and it's a thriving, wonderful place. It's one of my favorite places on the Gulf of Mexico now, is downtown Pensacola. But as far as the paper pulp industry, of course, the South, particularly along the Gulf region, in the Gulf region, has the natural resource, has the raw product, and that's the pine trees. And of course, the great longleaf pine forests range from Virginia down to Lake Okeechobee over to Texas, and some 92 million acres of pine, loblolly and longleaf pine, which was ideal for turning pine pulp into paper. The one problem was, and initially they could only do kraft paper, meaning brown paper, like as in grocery store bags, paper bags, which you rarely see these days, but or box packaging. But in the 1930s, the industry perfected the bleaching process using dioxins to turn that the pine pulp a pure white, to create the kind of paper that we have today. The problem with that is there was a lot of waste and toxic waste involved in that manufacturing process, and the manufacturing process uses a lot of water that you have to take out of a river or some body of water or bay or bayou. And so these pulp paper plants were located all around the Gulf Coast. A river that would flow to a bay or sound, such as Mississippi Sound, or right directly on a bay or a bayou. And the discharge would go directly into that water. And so that industry, which is one of the highest polluting industries in the world, had a tremendous impact. It killed it didn't just kill the bays, but it killed the fishing industry in some places, such as East Bay in Panama City, which was a very robust oyster fishery at one time, until a pulp plant was located on East Bay. And that destroyed the oyster fishing in East Bay. And so not only did you get the stench in the air, when I lived in Fort Walton Beach, we could smell it too on the right wind. Either blowing from Pensacola, if the wind was blowing out of the west, or blowing from Port St. Joe, if it was coming out of the east. So you had both air and water pollution that was connected with that industry, unfortunately.
Now, I've got my state tourism guide for Alabama, and one of the featured stories in there is about Jubilee and Mobile Bay, and we're all very familiar with that, and we think it's just some wonderful thing. But there's something bad behind that, right?
Well, what scientists have today have discovered is that the Jubilee today is probably not solely a natural event that has to do with the changing temperatures of the water under natural conditions, and that the fertilizer runoff has contributed to the die-off of much of life. That's part of that jubilee. So it's both natural and it's artificial. It's sort of like red tide. What the media has been calling in Florida red tide is primarily toxic algae that's coming from agricultural runoff. Red tide is part of it, but the toxic algae is exacerbating the red tide, and you would have these fish die-offs even without the red tide. In 2013, when I was down at Fort Myers researching the book, the Army Corps of Engineers and Florida State Water Management engineers had opened the floodgates and let the waters flow out of Lake Okeechobee down the Caloosahatchee River toward the Gulf of Mexico. And Lake Okeechobee is a big sump, the second largest freshwater lake within the continental U.S., wholly within the continental U.S. It's a huge sump for Florida agriculture, both sugar, sawgrass industry, and cattle. In opening those floodgates, people took YouTube videos of this. You could see the brown water coming down the Caloosahatchee River into Pine Island Sound, where that first tarpon was caught, where Ponce de Leon landed and got into skirmishes with the Calusas, and flowing on out into the Gulf. Well, when I was checking into this hotel, the clerk checking in a German family, tourists next to me, was warning them, "We advise you not to go out on the beach." And of course, that's what they're there for. They're there for the beach. And if you do, don't go in the water and wear a face mask. We're under a red tide situation. And those were his exact words, red tide situation. And I wanted to say, I was screaming inside my head, it's not red tide. It's not red tide. It's toxic algae coming down the Caloosahatchee River. But it wouldn't have made any difference. It's whatever the case there. The vacation adventure of this family and thousands of others had been spoiled by this release of agricultural runoff.
So Aubrey, when you go on vacation next year to Sanibel Island, make sure you take extra bail money because it is unlawful to throw a mollusk. Do you believe that?
Unlawful to throw a mollusk. I mean, not that I have any intention to, but
back in the water. Clarify, back in the water. A living one, because you can kill it.
Oh,
you think you're doing good. You see a live mollusk and up on the beach, and you think you're doing the right thing by throwing it back in the water, but that impact can kill that animal. And so the best thing to do is just walk it into the water and place it.
I'm going to coddle it and walk it back in.
Coddle it and walk it back. Talk to it, like you do your plants, your house plants, to make them grow nicely. Play some classical music while you're at it.
Oh, that's awesome. I put it on the phone. It's beautiful there. I haven't been there since I was a kid.
Oh, yeah, it still is beautiful. It's become popular, so it's been discovered. So wintertime, the traffic is pretty horrendous, but it is beautiful. They've done a wonderful job of preserving their natural vegetation and, of course, their beaches. They very much care about that. And, there's nothing over 3 stories high on Sanibel. So it is still very much a wonderful place. And
Bill,
you know what I like about Sanibel?
What's that?
Sorry, but next time you go there is you can see both the sunrise. If you're in the right place in Sanibel, you can see the sun rising over the water, and you can see it setting over the water.
Now that's a good spot.
Yeah, yes. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah. So, Bill, I see the future of our next WeatherBrains convention on Sanibel Island.
Yeah, maybe you could put a good word in with Jan.
They have, all right. So they have the Great Banyan. That's where they have the Great Banyan trees, right? Yeah.
And compare and contrast the development, the irresponsible development in places like Cape Coral and Fort Myers versus Sanibel. Like you've already sort of alluded to the good. Talk about the bad.
Yeah. Well, Cape Coral is your perfect development storm, if you will, which was developed in the 1950s, and Cape Coral's on the mainland, and it was an area on the mainland that was a lot of scrubland, pine forest, prairie, and what we call Florida prairie, which is both wet and dry depending on the time of the year, but also banded by mangrove forests around the edge. And the developers who were from Baltimore wanted to create as much waterfront as possible in developing this land and single homes, primarily single family homes. And to do that, they ended up blowing out, digging out, bulldozing out much of those mangroves and digging what we call finger canals and creating. And you could, if you Google Earth Cape Coral, Florida, you can see what I'm talking about in creating all this waterfront that they could sell at a higher price. And they were trying to sell to retirees from the Northeast and Midwest. And of course, one of the lures was great fishing. But another one of those ironies is that they were destroying the very thing that made the fish so plentiful in that area by ripping out those mangroves and destroying the estuarine environment. And so there wasn't really controlled growth on Cape Coral. In other places in Florida, through the 1950s, a developer could, and it's not necessarily the developer's fault, but the developer could dredge up bay bottom with rubber stamp permission from the state of Florida and local county commissioners and dig up bay bottom and create new real estate by creating these what we call these finger isles or finger inlets along the coast and cram more people on the waterfront. John D. MacDonald, one of my favorite writers from the mid-20th century, who died in 1980s, a fiction writer, the original Florida suspense crime thriller writer, who Carl Hyacin and Randy Wainwright consider their model for writing their own stories of Florida. He was an activist because he lived in Sarasota and he saw all these dredge and fill projects happening. And he was also a fisherman, and he saw his fishing luck diminish significantly whenever the new development, waterside development came along. But he said something that I love. He said, Florida is the only state in the union that's growing larger in size because these developers were dredging up bay bottom and creating more real estate. That's not quite true. Other states have done the same thing. But Florida was certainly at the forefront of dredge and fill projects.
I have a question for you. So when you're doing all this research, what was probably the most interesting thing that you think you discovered when writing?
One of the most interesting things, I think, as an environmental historian, I'm always looking for connections. A lot of historians are interested in conflict, but I like connections, whether it's between people across time, between places. And I think of history as like an ecosystem. And one of the most interesting connections I discovered in researching the Gulf of Mexico dead zone was this direct connection between the Gulf of Mexico dead zone and baby boom era Saturday morning cartoon commercials. I'll say it again, direct connection between the Gulf of Mexico dead zone and baby boom era Saturday morning cartoon commercials. And if you want to know that connection, you'll have to read the book.
So good teaser there, man. I don't know how we're going to put that one together.
Here's another one. So the first oil well drilled offshore out of sight of land was sunk off the coast of Louisiana in 1947. And I found a connection between that oil well, that first out of sight of land oil well in the country, and the actor Jimmy Stewart, who was not an investor in the oil well, although he did invest in Texas oil, but he was not an investor in this oil well. But there was another connection with Jimmy Stewart. Again, I'm not going to tell you what that connection is. You'll have to read the book. But I loved writing about that connection, and then just some fascinating people. Every day I'd sit down, almost every day I sit down and write, and there would be some surprise that would come along. Nash Roberts. I didn't know about Nash Roberts until I started, despite doing preliminary research, I didn't know about him until I started writing the chapter on hurricanes. And suddenly this fantastic character emerges. And the more I learned about Nash Roberts, the more interesting he became. And there are many people like that in the book. Diane Wilson, who was this shrimper and fish house operator in Texas, who almost single-handedly stopped heavy industry around Lavaca Bay from polluting. And this is in the 20th century. She's doing this in the late 20th century. And some of you may be familiar with Walter Anderson, the Ocean Springs, Mississippi artist, who I refer to as the Gulf of Mexico artist laureate. There was nobody. I mean, he's the most fascinating character. He was a great inspiration for me in writing this book. He's the guy who really showed me how to write this book. So there are many people like that, and many surprises almost on a daily basis that made writing this book not only labor of love, but a lot of fun.
Hey, guys, let me call a timeout here because I am the lead. Now, so Aubrey, let me ask you this: are you able to do an email segment? Because we've not done one in 4 years.
We do a 30-minute email tonight.
I know.
I
know.
I had a funny feeling we just might have an overflowing email inbox.
Letters. We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
Two things. I don't know why my camera keeps refocusing, but most people listen anyways. And two, is it almost official? It looks like the center is not quite there yet on a landfall.
It's over the western. It's over the west. It's over the western tip of Dauphin Island. It's going to be on the
Generation Center now.
It's going to be on the Mississippi coast at Pascagoula, really the Alabama-Mississippi border in a matter of minutes. But yeah, the western tip of Dauphin Island has the eye, if you will, the circulation center on top of it right now. So and we have a tornado warning too, east of Pensacola.
And we've had a wind gust of, what did you say, James? Was it 77 miles an hour?
Yeah, we watching the Fort Morgan observations. They got a wind gust of 77. Fort Morgan is on the far western tip of Baldwin County, Alabama, kind of right there at the mouth of Mobile Bay. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff going on down there. But let's do some email real quick, and then I'm going to roll Brian and Tony, and I got to go do some television. So Aubrey, you go.
All right. Marcus Toop sent us a picture of poor Jim Cantori in the airport. That guy can't go anywhere without a photo of him. And it says, everybody get out of Gulfport. Jim Cantori just got off the plane here. So we have another email from Steve Hannes. Our Kansas City beloved meteorologist Gary Lezak predicted Hurricane Gordon 8 months ago. He predicted that there would be, let me pull it up if the computer will agree. It's giving me a little slowdown. Okay, January 10th, 2018 prediction, 75% chance of a hurricane within a few days of September 1st. So Gary Lee,
we got to get him back on the show.
You were so mean to him last time, he probably won't come back.
No, he'll never come back. But I saw Gary England, the legend of Oklahoma City, tweeted today. Gary said, at first, I thought the guy was a nut. I thought he was crazy as a loon. But now Gary England believes in this system he has. So, we'll see.
We'll see. Like you say, peer-reviewed papers, and that'll go a long way. All right, Justin Cook sent a question, and Nate actually responded to this one earlier. Iowa State and Nebraska had to cancel their first games this weekend as storms approached. The game was delayed. Apparently, it wasn't maybe the communication did not go over very well at, I know necessarily the Nebraska stadium. And Nate did kind of reply that the AMS has recently issued a statement concerning weather safety. And I think we all know that there are some stadiums that do an amazing job of communicating with the public and with weather safety, while others maybe it's still an area of opportunity.
Yeah, James, real quick, what are we going to do at Alabama? And because I mean that's where I go to college football games. What is the plan there if a big thunderstorm were to break out and be bearing down on the stadium? Where would they send us?
Talking about tornado warning or lightning?
Yeah, either, I guess. Well, I guess you'd go into the stadium for lightning, or would they carry you out to
they just want people to go on those concourses for lightning. They just want to get people out of the seats and get them with the concession stand areas. And for a tornado, the university, we ought to get those guys on the show. What we ought to do is have Texas Embassy, Kevin Closel, and the University of Alabama EMA guy to come on and talk about it, because they do have a plan to get people down in the bowels of the stadium for a tornado warning. But the problem is they can't get 100,000 people in there.
Right.
And, it's like Talladega. There's only so much you can do. So.
All right. And I've got just another minute because I've got to run. I think that was my page. All right. Mason Gleva sent us a listener survey response. Mason's from Goshen, Indiana, and found us on YouTube and is planning on majoring in meteorology in college. So congratulations and good luck. You'll do great. Max Shaw sent us the Earth Null School map, which Max stumbled across, showing, of course, the wind flow and the wind stream. So that's always a great graphic. And Tony Race sent us in. Austin is stationing wireless webcams to flood-prone roads to provide images to go along with flood gauges to educate and encourage drivers to avoid the area. So it's a story from WAMU. Can't tell where it's flooded. Look at your phone and stay safe. So that's kind of interesting. Jay Farlow, guest suggestion, Hannah Strong as a guest to recap her NWA presentation on social media harassment. And we have contact information in their bill if you don't already have it. And let's see if we can get down a little bit more. We'll have one. An idea for a future guest on episode 417. Brian Peters mentioned one of the highlights of his career was being one of the few individuals to say he's flown into a Category 5 hurricane during Ivan in 2004. And now Tina Stahl, forecaster at Honolulu, NWS Honolulu, flew on a reconnaissance mission into Hurricane Lane recently and was on the mission that determined the upgrade of Lane from a Cat 4 to a Cat 5. Having her on the show, along with Robert Ballard, the Sioux at NWS Honolulu, a social media gem in relaying the information in regards to Hurricane Lane. So sounds like a really couple of great guest ideas. And my computer's not working, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up. If you have an email guest suggestion, maybe a link, if you have a show topic you would like to see, or just want to tell us what you like and what you don't like about the show, you can forward it over to email@weatherbrains.com. If you are suggesting a guest, please forward some contact information. It would make it much easier for our amazing guest booking officer, Mr. Bill Murray. He likes life to be easy.
Yes. So let's take a break for Professor Peters and Tony Rice. We're going to come back and Bill's going to run the weather roundup, picks of the week, and much more as WeatherBrains rolls along.
WeatherBrains 101 with Professor Peters.
In this episode of WeatherBrains 101, we're going to complete a 4-part series looking into the operations of aircraft used by NOAA to study and observe tropical weather systems. Pulling all of the NOAA aircraft together is the Aircraft Operations Center. The P-3s and the Gulfstream 4 are based at NOAA's Aircraft Operations Center at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida. AOC is part of NOAA's Office of Marine and Aviation Operations, which includes civilians as well as officers of the NOAA Corps, one of the nation's 7 uniformed services. NOAA Corps pilots and civilian flight engineers, meteorologists, and electronic engineers are highly trained to operate in the kind of adverse weather conditions the craft on the ground. Instrumentation flown aboard NOAA aircraft is designed, built, assembled, and engineering division. During season months, the P3s and the Gulfstream 4 are tailored by AOC engineers, severe weather and atmospheric research programs by its worldwide in a variety of weather conditions. This completes the four-part series about hurricane hunting with NOAA aircraft. If you have a question about the weather, you can drop an email to question@weatherbrains.com.
Where's Tony? Kevin?
Not here.
Did I lose my bandwidth completely there? I don't know. That was interesting. So no Tony tonight, but an interesting Professor Peter. So Kevin, do you have to go at 10 or do you get to hang around?
I have to go a couple minutes before 10. Yes, even though we're well inland, we have, the produce, as James always says, the producers want you at the top of the show and that kind of a thing for tropical systems. Again, even though we're in Wichita Falls.
Yeah, so the tropical storm near hurricane is the big story tonight. Flash flood watches all the way up into Arkansas, and tropical storm warnings all the way up into southern Mississippi. So going to be an interesting night. I hope we can get some rain over here tomorrow without any tornadoes, because we're going to be on that favorable side for severe weather.
Yes. In fact, if I may, I got to run, but I'll do my picks of the week. Can we do?
Yes, hit it, Kevin.
It's got a couple of shout outs to things going on the campus of OU and the National Weather Center. First, I want to say hello to Nolan Meister, who is a student at OU, meteorology student, came up to me after the Dr. Jacobs presentation and said hello. So hello, Nolan, and thank you for listening to the show. Also, you mentioned Kevin Claisel. Is it Claisel? That's how you pronounce his last name, isn't it?
Like I've always thought it was Closel, but
Closel?
I could be incorrect.
I thought it was anyway. Kevin gets he gets a shout out because the event was in the big atrium there, at the National Weather Center, and it's full of PhDs and all these legendary weather people. I remember sitting there looking down at the other end of the row I was sitting. I was sitting next to Kim, who's a big shot, and then I look down the row and I go, oh wow, that's Eric Rasmussen. He's a big deal. Oh, look behind him. There's Lou Wicker. And I'm going, who invited me? How did I get into this thing? But shout out to Kevin, because there's all these legendary weather people, and it was a beautiful sunny day, but he started the meeting making sure everyone knew where the storm shelters were and the second exits to the atrium in the Weather Center. And then my pick of the week is a shout out to the folks at the Oklahoma Mesonet. They have graciously invited me to participate in part of their OK First presentation that's coming up later this month. There's 4 days of workshops and classes for a lot of emergency management type people, and there's going to be a media panel discussion coming up on Thursday, I think it is, and that's what I'm going to participate in. But a really nice thank you to them for inviting me, and all the information on their OK First event, which again is coming up later this month, will be my pick of the week.
So will you be acting as the accelerant at all these events that you're attending, Kevin?
Probably not. Other than going into labor for Kim, that's about the extent of it.
That's outstanding. Well,
I'm trying to be better.
Well, there's a time and place for everything. So, my pick of the week is the Satellite Liaison blog. It was just one of the millions of picks that my notebook brought back from NWA. If you spend that money to go to the NWA annual meeting, there's no reason to ever get the foghorn again, right?
Well, yeah, I got a dash, but congratulations again on another successful event. I think you made a change, in Birmingham back in 2011, where you raised the bar, and I guess from what I hear, it continues to be raised. So congrats on another good event.
Well, about 200 people had a big part in that, and another nearly 6,000 that came. So thanks for sticking around late. Jack, you kind of see a trend going here. These picks of the week. I don't know that I warned you about that.
No, you did not warn me about that.
I always like to watch the guest squirm, right when you get to this.
Yeah, I suppose I can squirm. Well, maybe the pick of, I don't know. The pick of the week is a relaxing week, okay? For me, I wanted to say, since April when the book won the Pulitzer, I've done at least 36 media interviews, and this has been a really enjoyable one. Probably my favorite of all of them. You guys have great synergy, and so for me, this has really been the pick of the week. And I do book events every week, and this week I happen to have off. So I want to be selfish in my pick of the week, if I may. And I also want to say that I'm coming to Birmingham to give a public talk at UAB on January 17th. It'll be evening talk, open to the public, free and open to the public. January 17th, UAB. Right.
You can.
I don't know what time
let
yet.
me go without reminding me that that's going to happen. I'll make myself a note.
Yeah.
We'll have to go and have a snake handler while you're here. How about that?
And should I say go Gators, or should I refrain from that?
No, it's good. It's all SEC, you know.
No, actually, usually I don't.
It's all good that we get to the Mercedes-Benz Super.
No, right. And I'll spare you of the Gator chomp.
Well, the SEC got off to a good start this week with 13 wins, and
isn't that amazing?
Yeah, of them by more than 20 points. So it should be a good year for SEC football for sure.
Well, here in Gainesville, the best time to go grocery shopping is during the game.
There's no question. Between the beach, which, I think 70% of Birmingham dumps to the beach.
Yeah.
And the rest, I mean, you could get in any restaurant in Birmingham at 6:00 Saturday night, in between the Auburn game, which was huge, and the Alabama game. I mean, literally a restaurant that we thought we had no chance to just, walk in at the last second. We literally walked in at 6:00 and got a table. So, that's the good side to it. I wanted to ask you one more question, Jack, before I let you get away, because it's in the news in Alabama. A lot of controversy over dredging a bigger ship channel in Mobile Bay, and there's been a tremendous amount of controversy over it. So, talk about that for a second.
Well, I can understand the controversy because it's a real trade-off, because supposedly the larger channel will allow for larger ships or larger barges and supposedly pick up commerce and stimulate the economy. But the trade-off is that when you dig those channels, you are I'm a broken record here, but you're destroying the estuaries. And those estuaries are important both ecologically and economically. And sometimes you think you're being cost effective and when you're sacrificing a natural place. But quite often, economically, there's a downside that outweighs what you think is the upside. The other thing is that these estuarine environments are fantastic carbon sinks, and they absorb carbon in the water, carbon in the air, and however it's increasing, it is indeed increasing. But those natural places, those living shorelines, those seagrass beds, those oyster beds, those coastal marshes, all absorb carbon, and so they benefit us in many ways that we often don't calculate into cost-benefit analysis, and I think they should be calculated. So I hope that there's a legitimate and robust discussion about this, and nobody becomes violent, of course, but this is something that certainly deserves a community discussion. And so I hope that the powers that be indeed allow a fair discussion of this matter. Because ultimately it's the people who are affected. But so that's my contribution.
Hopefully we can get back to a more civil discord in this country. It would be really,
absolutely.
To become more civil for sure. And so that's good. Well, I have to congratulate you again on your book, because a lot of times I end up with books on here that are sent to me by publicists and things like that. But I saw this at a bookstore in St. Louis and fell in love with it and picked it up and started reading it, couldn't stop because, like you say, it does, apply to everyone everywhere. But, for people in the South, it has a special meaning, and it almost is a reflection of my childhood. Their videos are 8mm home movies of me and that development that you talk about in Panama City, which was a Birmingham developer. My uncle bought a shrimp boat at one time because he subscribed to the theory you had that you could pay for it in 5 years or less. And it was just the stories are amazing, and it helps you appreciate this special treasure that we have in the Gulf of Mexico. Well,
in my talks, I give I see that appreciation for the special treasure, and I've been giving talks in Maine and Massachusetts and Chicago. It's everywhere I go, and it's really heartwarming to see that love for the Gulf of Mexico, and for it to get an attention beyond an oil spill or a devastating hurricane, and a sunning beach as well. So It's really wonderful to see that.
Well, we thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for staying up late, and thank you for all the kind comments. And I will look forward to January 17th. So make sure we get in touch between now and then, and we'll have to go out and have dinner.
That sounds fantastic. I look forward to it, Bill.
Well, WeatherBrains is the weekly netcast. It's all about weather. We do this generally on Monday nights. Holidays sometimes get in the way. Sometimes vacations and other things get in the way, but generally we're here on Monday nights. We've been doing this for nearly 15 years, believe it or not. And so you think at some point we might get it right, but I think we got it right tonight with our special guest, Jack Davis. Jack, we thank you again for being here. Anyway, people can get in touch with you if they need to give you a shout.
Well, they can email me. I'm easy to find at the University of Florida website, or just my name, Jack E. Davis, no period. Jack, the E and the letter, Davis at gmail.com. I hear from people from all over the country, enjoying hearing from them.
Well, good. Well, until next Monday night, I hope that you have a great week and stay hurricane free wherever you are. It's going to be a busy couple of weeks in the tropics here coming up. So hopefully we'll keep most of those shied away from the United States. But until we get a chance to talk again, I'm Bill Murray for the whole WeatherBrains crew saying have a great week and God bless. All right, Jack. Thank you so much. Just
my pleasure.
Anytime.
Yeah.
Have a good one.
So we'll be in touch. Okay. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
tornado warning, and there's a tornado watch down there until 4 a.m. And I forgot WeatherBrains is still going here. Oh, it's the simulcast, and why are 11 people still watching? Hello, friends. Here we go. So we're now simulcasting on Instagram and WeatherBrains. How's that for an interesting synergy? WeatherBrains, thank you guys for Tuesday night special. Had a great show tonight. Look forward to hearing it. And I did not roll Tony Rice and his astronomy report live. We're going to edit that into the audio version. That'll be in the audio podcast version. So WeatherBrains will be back on Monday night next week, 8:30 Central, 9:30 Eastern. We'll see you guys then. Thank you all for watching. Have a great week.